Marcus Johnson stared at the planted evidence bag, his DEA credentials hidden in his jacket. Officer Brennan smirked not, realizing he had just arrested the highest-ranking black federal agent in the region. 20 years of fighting corruption from within was about to pay off spectacularly. Before we dive into this shocking story of injustice and redemption, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to follow this incredible journey of how one corrupt cop's biggest mistake led to a reckoning that changed an entire city. What would you do if you were in Marcus Johnson's position? Let's find out what happens next. Marcus Johnson was not your average 52-year-old black man living in Riverdale, the predominantly white suburb of West Point City. As the deputy director of the DEA's Midwest Division, he had spent 25 years running undercover operations against drug cartels, earning commendations that filled a drawer he rarely opened. Despite his high-ranking federal position, Marcus deliberately maintained a low profile in his community, partly out of professional necessity and partly because he understood that in Riverdale, a black man in an expensive car was still just a black man in an expensive car to many of the local police. The subtle, daily discrimination he faced ranged from suspicious glances at the grocery store to neighbors who still expressed surprise at his articulate speech after 15 years on the same street. His reputation in federal law enforcement circles was sterling, characterized by methodical investigation techniques and an unwavering ethical code that sometimes frustrated colleagues who preferred shortcuts. For the past 3 months, Marcus had been quietly investigating disturbing rumors of a drug pipeline involving corrupt officers in the West Point Police Department, a delicate operation he'd kept off official books until he had concrete evidence. His family provided the stability that counterbalanced his high-stress career, with his wife Elaine heading cardiovascular research at West Point Medical Center and their daughter Tiana following in her father's justice-oriented footsteps as a second-year law student at Georgetown. The only shadow on Marcus's otherwise successful life was his strained relationship with his younger brother Calvin, who had spent 6 years in prison for drug possession charges that Marcus had always suspected were fabricated, creating a rift between them that had never fully healed, with Calvin believing Marcus could have done more to help him, but chose his career instead. On the other side of town, Officer Bradley Kemp started his patrol shift the way he had for the past 8 years, with a combination of entitlement and resentment simmering just beneath his badge. At 34, the white officer had accumulated 17 excessive force complaints, all involving black suspects, yet his personnel file remained unblemished thanks to the protection of senior officers and the department's systematic burial of civilian complaints. What the official records didn't show was Kemp's role as a trusted lieutenant in Captain Howard Miller's lucrative side operation, a police-run drug distribution network that had been operating unchecked for nearly a decade. Kemp had developed a reputation among his fellow corrupt officers for his skill at planting evidence on black men to both meet the department's unofficial arrest quotas and supply Miller's network with drugs confiscated during Dacian. Too high. T's fraudulent arrests. His racism wasn't subtle, with offensive comments flowing freely in the precinct's break room, met with either approving chuckles or uncomfortable silence from colleagues who knew better than to challenge the protected officer. His recent divorce had left him financially desperate, paying alimony to a wife who had finally tired of his volatile temper, pushing him to take increasingly dangerous risks to maintain his income stream from Captain Miller's operation. The final ingredient in Kemp's toxic worldview was his particular hatred for federal agents, whom he regularly described as pencil-pushing bureaucrats who interfered with real police work, a resentment that would soon prove catastrophically misplaced. That Wednesday evening, Marcus was driving home through Riverdale after meeting with a confidential informant who had provided new information about missing evidence from the West Point Police Department's lockup information, too, sensitive to document through official channels. As he turned onto Oakwood Drive, he noticed the police cruiser that had been following him for the past 3 blocks, a familiar occurrence in his neighborhood that he had documented dozens of times before. When the flashing lights activated behind him, Marcus already knew the drill, pulling over promptly and placing his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible. Through his rearview mirror, he recognized Officer Kemp, approaching, having seen his photo in multiple civilian complaints that had crossed his desk. In that moment, Marcus made a calculated decision that would change everything, choosing not to immediately identify himself as a federal agent, recognizing an opportunity to document firsthand the discrimination he had been investigating. As Kemp approached with his hand resting on his holstered weapon, Marcus discreetly activated the recording devices he carried as standard procedure, both the audio recorder in his jacket pocket and the small camera disguised as a tie clip, standard-issue DEA surveillance equipment that had captured countless drug deals but was about to serve a very different purpose. The officer's unnecessarily aggressive approach, calling for backup before even reaching the vehicle, confirmed Marcus's suspicions that this would not be a routine traffic stop, especially when he heard Kemp radio in that he had another one in a tone that needed no further explanation to his colleagues. License and Registration Officer Kemp barked his flashlight beam, deliberately aimed into Marcus's eyes, despite the street being well lit. A common intimidation tactic Marcus had heard described by countless black residents of Tepligine. Riverdale. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Officer Marcus inquired calmly, maintaining direct eye contact while slowly reaching for his wallet. "You made an illegal lane change back there," Kemp replied with obvious fabrication, as Marcus had been driving straight on a single-lane residential street for the past mile. "I don't think I did, sir," Marcus responded evenly, carefully, choosing his words to be respectful yet firm, knowing from experience how quickly these situations could escalate. "Are you calling me a liar?" Kemp's voice rose sharply, his hand moving to rest on his holstered weapon, the universal threat that needed no further explanation. "No, sir. Just trying to understand the situation," Marcus replied, handing over his civilian driver's license and registration, deliberately withholding his federal credentials for now as he continued recording the increasingly hostile interaction. The arrival of a second patrol car cast alternating blue and red lights across the scene as Officer Sean Donovan, Kemp's regular partner, approached, with noticeably less aggression but clear discomfort written across his features. "What have we got?" Brad Donovan asked, staying a few steps back. "Just another entitled one who doesn't know his place," Kemp replied, not bothering to lower his voice as he examined Marcus's license. "Look at this fancy Riverdale address and everything probably selling to all the rich white kids in the neighborhood," he added, with a sneer, the casual racism flowing naturally. "We should check him for warrants. Bet he's got priors," Kemp continued the comment, clearly audible on Marcus's recording device. "I don't have any warrants or prior arrests," Officer Kemp Marcus stated calmly, noting the flicker of surprise when he used the officer's name without having been introduced a small psychological advantage in the unfolding confrontation. "Step out of the vehicle now," Kemp ordered abruptly, clearly agitated by Marcus's composed demeanor, which stood in stark contrast to the fearful compliance he typically encountered and exploited. Marcus complied slowly and deliberately, making no sudden movements as he exited the vehicle, standing to his full 6'1" height, which visibly irritated the shorter officer. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle," came the next command. And again, Marcus complied while continuing to maintain the dignified composure that seemed to further provoke the officer. The ensuing search was unnecessarily rough, with Kemp using excessive pressure as he patted down Marcus's legs and torso, deliberately digging his fingers into sensitive areas and slamming Marcus against the car when he flinched in. Response: "I need you to understand, officer, that this seems like an unnecessary escalation of a routine traffic stop," Marcus stated for the record, knowing his devices were capturing every word and action. "Shut your mouth unless I ask you a question," Kemp snapped, continuing his aggressive search, while Officer Donovan watched with visible discomfort but made no move to intervene. What happened next was precisely what Marcus had suspected might occur, but was still shocking to experience firsthand, as Kemp reached into his own pocket and smoothly transferred a small plastic bag to his gloved hand before discovering it in the back seat of Marcus's car. Well, well, what do we have here? Kemp announced triumphantly, holding up the bag of white powder for his partner to see, his body positioned to block Marcus's car camera from capturing the plant, unaware of the tie-clip camera that had a perfect angle of the entire maneuver. "That's not mine," Marcus stated, firmly deciding to maintain his civilian cover. For now, seeing the bigger picture unfolding before him, a chance to expose not just one corrupt officer, but potentially an entire system. "That's what they all say." Kemp laughed, exchanging a look with Donovan, who appeared increasingly uncomfortable with the situation but remained silent. Sean bagged this up as evidence, Kemp instructed, tossing the planted drugs to his partner, while roughly spinning Marcus around and slamming him against the vehicle again, this time applying handcuffs with unnecessary force. "Marcus Johnson, you're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance," Kemp announced with evident satisfaction, tightening the cuffs to a painful degree. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," he continued, reciting the Miranda rights with practiced efficiency while maintaining the excessive pressure. As Marcus was roughly guided toward the patrol car, he noticed Officer Donovan's hesitation as he handled the planted evidence, carefully observing how the younger officer avoided direct eye contact, a tell that suggested Donovan might not be as comfortable with corruption as his partner. "Back seat's where you belong, isn't it?" Kemp taunted as he pushed Marcus into the cruiser with unnecessary force, causing his head to bang against the doorframe, a move so practiced it could only have been deliberate. "Man, Captain Miller's gonna love this. Another dealer off the streets," Kemp said to Donovan loudly enough for Marcus to hear the mention of Captain Miller, immediately registering as significant in Marcus's mental investigation. Notes: while Kemp returned to search Marcus's car more thoroughly, thankfully missing the hidden compartment where Marcus kept his DEA credentials and service weapon, Marcus calculated his next moves carefully, weighing the immediate relief of revealing his identity against the larger opportunity to expose systemic corruption, ultimately deciding that the temporary indignity would serve the greater good of justice. The 20-minute drive to the West Point Police Department's main precinct was filled with Kemp's running commentary about cleaning up the streets and how "you people never learn," each racist remark, adding to the evidence, being captured by Marcus's still-active recording devices, while Officer Donovan's increasing silence spoke volumes about his discomfort with the situation. Upon arrival at the precinct, Marcus was subjected to the full humiliation intentionally built into the booking process, roughly handled during the fingerprinting procedure. His requests to make his phone call repeatedly denied, and his professional demeanor met with mockery from the booking officers who followed Kemp's lead in their treatment of the suspect. The unusual presence of Captain Howard Miller overseeing a seemingly routine drug arrest didn't escape Marcus's notice. The captain's keen interest in the booking process and his private conversation with Kemp in the corner, suggesting this was more than just another arrest for the department. "Got a real nice one here," Cap Marcus overheard Kemp telling Miller, driving a $60,000 car in Riverdale, definitely dealing to the suburbs. The captain's approving nod and pat on Kemp's shoulder confirming the corrupt relationship Marcus had suspected existed within the department's command structure. Marcus's silent observation of departmental practices revealed numerous violations of procedure and civil rights that went far beyond his own case, noting how other black detainees were processed compared to the white suspects, disparate bail recommendations, and the pattern of evidence handling that suggested widespread corruption rather than isolated incidents. When the officers discovered Marcus's government-issued phone and repeatedly failed to unlock it, their frustration mounted visibly with Kemp, suggesting they lose it in processing, until Captain Miller advised caution, sensing something wasn't quite adding up about their suspect. It was only when Marcus was finally left alone with the booking sergeant, an older officer named Rodriguez, who seemed less comfortable with the obvious mistreatment, that he decided the time had come to reveal his true identity. "Sergeant, I think there's something you should know," Marcus said quietly, meeting the officer's eyes directly. "My credentials are in a hidden compartment in my vehicle. Left side panel. You'll find my DEA badge and ID card there. I'm Deputy Director Marcus Johnson of the Midwest Division," he stated calmly, watching the blood drain from Sergeant Rodriguez's face as the implications of what had transpired began to dawn on him. The transformation in Sergeant Rodriguez's demeanor was immediate and dramatic, his professional mask cracking to reveal naked panic as he processed Marcus's statement, his eyes darting to the security camera in the corner before leaning closer. "Deputy Director Johnson, DEA," he whispered hoarsely, the gravity of the situation crashing down around him like a collapsing building. "Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," Sergeant Marcus replied, evenly maintaining the composed demeanor that had served him throughout his career. "My credentials will confirm everything, assuming Officer Kemp hasn't disposed of them already, which would add federal evidence tampering to the growing list of charges." The sergeant's hand actually trembled as he reached for his radio, then thought better of it, opting instead to step outside the processing room. His urgent whispers in the hallway clearly audible even through the closed door. What followed was like watching a controlled demolition, as word spread through the precinct, the news traveling in urgent whispers and wide-eyed stares directed toward the processing room. Officers suddenly finding reasons to walk past the window for a glimpse of the federal agent they'd been mistreating for the past 2 hours. Officer Kemp's reaction, when informed, proved the most, telling his initial bluster, giving way to a sickly pallor as he backed against the wall, eyes darting toward the exit before Captain Miller grabbed his arm in a grip that looked painful even from a distance. The two men engaged in a heated, whispered exchange that ended with Kemp being marched into an interview room and the door firmly closed. The atmosphere in the station transformed as if someone had flipped a switch, the previous contempt replaced by a nervous formality as Marcus was quickly uncuffed and escorted to what appeared to be the most comfortable room in the precinct, a staff break room hastily cleared of officers. "Can I get you some coffee?" Sir asked an officer who had earlier suggested that Marcus would look good in prison, orange. The dramatic reversal would have been amusing under different circumstances. "I'll wait for my colleagues, thank you," Marcus replied calmly, noting how several officers were now busily scrubbing records from the system, their frantic activity visible through the glass partition separating the break room from the main floor. Chief Wallace's arrival 30 minutes later added another layer to the unfolding drama, the department head bursting through the doors with the harried look of a man called away from an important dinner, still adjusting his tie as he was briefed by a visibly distressed Captain Miller, the chief's expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally the forced professional smile of a man preparing for damage control as he approached the break room. Deputy Director Johnson Chief Wallace began extending his hand, which Marcus pointedly did not accept. "There seems to have been a serious misunderstanding tonight. I want to personally assure you that this is not how our department operates." "And save it," Chief Wallace Marcus interrupted calmly. "Everything from the moment I was pulled over has been recorded, including Officer Kemp planting evidence in my vehicle, the excessive force, the rights violations, and, most interestingly, Captain Miller's conversation with Kemp about your department's targeting practices, all of which will be properly addressed through official channels." The chief's practiced smile faltered momentarily before he recovered, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial tone. "Surely we can discuss this professionally, one law enforcement leader to another. These are challenging times for police departments, as I'm sure you understand, and officers sometimes make mistakes in the field that can be addressed internally." "This wasn't a mistake," Chief Marcus cut him off again. "This was a deliberate act of corruption by officers who clearly felt protected enough within your department to act with impunity, which raises serious questions about the culture you've fostered here." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Marcus's wife Elaine, a formidable presence in her own right, who had called every contact in her husband's address book when he failed to return home or answer his phone setting. In motion, the federal response that was now descending upon the West Point Police Department. "Marcus, are you all right?" she demanded, the concern in her voice matched by the fury in her eyes as she took in the scene, cataloging the still visible marks on her husband's wrists from the over-tightened handcuffs. "I'm fine, Elaine," he assured her, the slight softening of his professional mask, the only indication of his relief at seeing her. though I can't say the same for the careers of several officers in this building. The next arrival proved even more disruptive to the precinct's already chaotic atmosphere, as DEA Director Alexandra Chen strode through the front doors flanked by 6 federal agents, her formidable presence parting the sea of local .40. Officers like Moses at the Red Sea. Deputy Director Johnson, she acknowledged with a nod, her calculating gaze taking in every detail of the situation before turning her attention to Chief Wallace with Arctic coldness. "Chief, I understand one of your officers arrested the second highest-ranking DEA official in the region on fabricated charges. I would very much like to hear your explanation while my agents secure all evidence and recordings from this." Precinct. Outside, the gathering of media vans added another layer of pressure to the imploding department. The predictable leak about a high-ranking federal official's wrongful arrest, drawing reporters like sharks to blood in the water. Their satellite trucks establishing a perimeter around the building as if laying siege. Chief Wallace's increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate a private resolution were met with Marcus's implacable refusal, his insistence on proper procedures and full accountability, making it clear that no backroom deal would make this situation disappear. "I want to be processed out properly," Marcus informed the chief in the presence of Director Chen. "Every form, every signature, everything by the book, with my attorney present to witness the proceedings," a statement that sent another ripple of panic through the department, as they realized he was creating an unimpeachable paper trail of everything that had occurred. When James Wilson, Marcus's personal attorney and former federal prosecutor, arrived 20 minutes later, the final piece fell into place for what was rapidly becoming the most significant police corruption case in the state's history. "Marcus, are you all right?" Wilson asked, his critical eye assessing his client and friend for any signs of mistreatment. "I've been better, James, but everything was captured on multiple devices," Marcus replied, the slight emphasis on multiple not lost on the increasingly nervous officers within earshot. The formal interview that followed in what was now a respectful and proper setting revealed the true extent of Marcus's strategic thinking as he methodically laid out not just the events of that evening, but produced a digital journal documenting 17 previous incidents of racial profiling he had experienced in Riverdale over the past 5 years, each meticulously recorded with dates, officer names, and pattern analysis that pointed to systemic rather than isolated incidents. "You've been building a case all this time," Director Chen asked, her professional demeanor not quite concealing her surprise at the thoroughness of her deputy's documentation. "I've been observing and recording," Alexandra Marcus corrected gently. "Every black person in America builds this case throughout their lifetime. I just had the training to document it properly and the position to do something about it when the time was right." The most shocking revelation came when Marcus explained that his investigation into the department had begun 3 months earlier based on a pattern of suspicious drug arrests and evidence discrepancies he had noticed while reviewing cases that intersected with DEA operations, suggesting that what had happened to him was not an isolated incident, but part of a coordinated corrupt practice. Can you imagine being in Marcus's position, wrongfully arrested, yet remaining calm enough to turn the tables on an entire corrupt system? Comment number 1. If you believe Marcus showed incredible restraint by not immediately revealing his identity. Or comment number 2. If you think he should have shut down Officer Kemp's abuse of power immediately. Don't forget to like and subscribe to follow this incredible story of justice being served. What do you think will happen when the federal investigation begins to uncover the full extent of corruption in the West Point Police Department? Will Officer Kemp face justice, or will the thin blue line protect him? The federal response to Marcus Johnson's wrongful arrest was swift and comprehensive, with DEA Director Alexandra Chen establishing a joint task force with the FBI within 4 hours of the incident, commandeering an entire floor of the EWWW.com federal building in downtown West Point as their base of operations. This isn't just about one corrupt officer or one wrongful arrest, Director Chen announced to the assembled team of 26 federal agents and attorneys. Deputy Director Johnson's documentation suggests a pattern of systematic civil rights violations, evidence tampering, and possible drug trafficking within the West Point Police Department. We will investigate this with the full resources of both agencies. United States Attorney Gloria Martinez, a veteran prosecutor with a reputation for tackling police corruption, took personal charge of the legal proceedings, her presence sending a clear message about how seriously the Justice Department was taking the case. "I want subpoenas for the entire department's records going back 10 years, she instructed her team of prosecutors. Personnel files, arrest records, evidence, logs, internal affairs, complaints, body cam footage, everything, and I want them served first thing tomorrow morning before they have time to destroy more evidence than they already have." The methodical approach of the federal investigators contrasted sharply with the chaos engulfing the West Point Police Department, where the realization that they were now under federal scrutiny had created clear divisions among the officers. Those with clean records and genuine commitment to ethical policing began distancing themselves from Kemp and others known to be part of Captain Miller's inner circle, while the corrupt officers closed ranks and began frantically attempting to cover their tracks. The most significant break in the case came unexpectedly early when Officer Sean Donovan contacted the task force less than 24 hours after Marcus's arrest, requesting protection in exchange for information. "I can't be part of this anymore," he told FBI Special Agent Tanya Williams during their initial meeting in a secure hotel room across town. "I've been watching it happen for 3 years, telling myself I was just following orders. But after seeing what they did to Deputy Director Johnson, knowing they've done the same thing to dozens of innocent people, I can't sleep at night anymore." Donovan's testimony proved invaluable, providing names, dates, and specific instances of evidence tampering, falsified reports, and the department's unofficial policy of targeting black men for arrests, particularly in affluent neighborhoods like Riverdale. Captain Miller calls it maintaining property values. Donovan explained the disgust evident in his voice. "They have quotas for how many black men to arrest each month. Kemp is their star performer he carries, planted evidence with him on every shift." With Donovan's cooperation secured, the floodgates began to open as other officers came forward, some seeking immunity deals, others simply unwilling to go down with what they now recognized as a sinking ship. A patrol officer named Jessica Martinez provided internal emails showing how complaints against Kemp and other corrupt officers were systematically buried, while a dispatcher named Robert Chen furnished recordings of suspicious communications between Captain Miller and known drug dealers in the area. The atmosphere within the department grew increasingly toxic as accusations and counter-accusations flew, with Captain Miller openly threatening officers he suspected of cooperation with the federal investigation. "Remember where your pension comes from," he was overheard telling a group of younger officers, the implied threat clear to everyone in the room. Meanwhile, Chief Wallace's attempts at damage control grew increasingly desperate, his press conferences evolving from confident assertions that a few bad apples would be dealt with to stammering defenses of his leadership as evidence of his knowledge of the corruption mounted. Mayor Sandra Parker's initial support for the police department quickly eroded as the political calculations shifted her public statements, carefully distancing herself from the growing scandal while calling for full transparency and accountability, a dramatic reversal from her previous unquestioning endorsement of Chief Wallace's leadership. Outside the police station, community activists organized daily protests that grew in size as more details of the department's corrupt practices emerged, with many participants sharing their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of West Point officers, creating a damning public record that supplemented the formal investigation. As the walls closed in around him, Officer Bradley Kemp made the predictable but ultimately futile attempt to flee the city, withdrawing his entire savings account of $62,000 in cash and throwing clothes into a $62,000 in cash suitcase before being intercepted by federal agents at the bus station. His planned escape to a non-extradition country cut short before it began. Before his arrest, however, Kemp had made contact with his drug connections outside the department, desperately seeking protection from people who had no interest in helping a liability like a disgraced police officer. "You're toxic now, man," his contact informed him bluntly, during a hastily arranged meeting in a downtown parking garage. "Captain Miller's already putting the word out that you acted alone, says you went rogue, and he had no knowledge of what you were doing. You're being set up as the fall guy." This betrayal triggered Kemp's survival instincts, leading him to make one last desperate move before his capture, breaking into the department's evidence room during the night shift, when he was supposedly off-duty but still had access, stealing files and digital records that implicated his superiors, his insurance policy for the inevitable moment when they tried to sacrifice him to save themselves. The federal prosecutors, however, were unimpressed by his attempted leverage, rejecting his initial immunity offer during his first court appearance. "Officer Kemp, you were caught on multiple recording devices, planting evidence and using excessive force against a federal agent, U.S." Attorney Martinez informed him coldly in the presence of his public defender, his personal attorney having abandoned him after learning the details of the case. "You're facing 25 years in federal prison. At minimum, your only hope for any leniency is complete and unconditional cooperation, beginning with a full confession and the names of every officer involved in this corruption scheme, from the lowest patrol officer to the highest-ranking official." The speed and efficiency of the federal investigation caught the corrupt officers off guard, accustomed as they were to the protection of a system they had manipulated for years, suddenly finding themselves exposed to the harsh light of justice without their usual shields. Marcus Johnson, meanwhile, provided detailed briefings to the task force about his observations and the patterns he had documented his years of experience in building complex cases against drug cartels, now applied to exposing corruption within law enforcement itself. "Look for their financial records," he advised the investigative team. Captain Miller and his inner circle are living well beyond their official salaries, offshore accounts, cash purchases, vacation properties under relatives' names. That's where you'll find proof of how deep this goes. As the investigation expanded beyond the initial incident, its scope grew to encompass not just the West Point Police Department, but its connections to the wider criminal ecosystem of the region, setting the stage for revelations that would shock even the most cynical observers of urban law enforcement. The Joint Task Force's investigation revealed a cancer far more metastasized than anyone had initially suspected, with tentacles extending beyond the West Point Police Department into a multi-state drug distribution network that the 70s extending beyond the West Point Police Department had been operating with impunity for nearly a decade. "We're looking at a sophisticated criminal enterprise operating under the protection of badges," FBI Special Agent Richard Torres explained during a secure briefing, pointing to a complex diagram that mapped connections between corrupt officers and drug organizations across 3 states. "Captain Miller isn't just allowing drugs to flow through West Point. He's actively managing distribution channels and using department resources to eliminate competition." The evidence was damning and comprehensive: financial records showing millions of dollars flowing through shell companies connected to Miller and 7 other senior officers, documentation of seized drugs being resold through department-protected dealers, and most disturbing of all, a pattern of suspicious deaths classified as drug-related that coincided with potential witnesses who might have exposed the operation. "They've been executing people and calling it overdoses," Torres continued grimly, displaying autopsy reports that had been falsified by a medical examiner now also under investigation. At least 16 deaths in the past 5 years show evidence of being staged. All victims were either small-time dealers who stepped on Miller's territory or individuals who had threatened to expose police involvement. The human toll of the corruption extended far beyond these murders, with the task force identifying over 300 cases of falsified arrests targeting black men, many of whom had spent years in prison on fabricated charges as part of the department's strategy to both generate arrest statistics and eliminate unwanted presence in certain neighborhoods. They were deliberately destroying black lives to maintain what they called community standards in white neighborhoods, U.S. Attorney Martinez stated, her voice tight with controlled anger as she reviewed the case files. The constitutional violations alone are staggering, but when you add the racial targeting element, we're looking at one of the most significant civil rights cases in recent history. Perhaps the most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered that Marcus Johnson had been deliberately targeted because his legitimate DEA investigations had begun to inadvertently intersect with the department's criminal operations. They knew exactly who you were, Director Chen informed Marcus during a private briefing. We found emails between Miller and Chief Wallace discussing how your operations were getting too close to their protected dealers. They've been monitoring your movements for months. This personal vendetta aspect was further confirmed when the task force uncovered evidence that the department had been systematically interfering with federal drug investigations, tipping off targets about raids, and seizing evidence before federal agents could secure it. They weren't just corrupt. They were actively working against federal law enforcement to protect their income stream, explained Special Agent Williams, outlining how the department had compromised at least 11 major DEA operations over the past 3 years. The pattern of harassment extended beyond Marcus to other black federal agents operating in the area with internal department communications, revealing an unofficial policy of targeting any black law enforcement officers with traffic stops and petty harassment, creating a hostile environment designed to discourage federal presence in their territory. The most personal connection emerged when investigators began reviewing the case file of Marcus's brother, Calvin, whose drug conviction 6 years earlier now appeared clearly to be another fabricated case orchestrated by the same network of corrupt officers. "They knew he was your brother," James Wilson told Marcus as they reviewed the newly uncovered evidence together. His arrest report was processed directly through Captain Miller's office, bypassing normal channels, and the officer who arrested him was partnered with Kemp at the time. The realization that his brother's imprisonment, which had caused their estrangement and years of family pain, was part of a deliberate strategy to undermine Marcus professionally while removing a potential witness to their operations, hit with unexpected emotional force. "We'll get his conviction overturned immediately." Wilson promised, placing a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder as he processed this painful revelation. As the federal investigation intensified, its impact rippled through the community, with victims of the department's false arrests coming forward in numbers that overwhelmed the task force's victim support resources. Black community leaders organized testimony sessions where residents shared similar experiences of planted evidence, excessive force, and fabricated charges, creating a powerful public record that supplemented the formal legal proceedings. Social media amplified these voices, with the hashtag #WestPointInjustice trending nationally as videos of testimony spread across platforms, bringing national attention to what had previously been dismissed as isolated complaints. Media coverage expanded from local outlets to national networks as the scale of the corruption became clear, with investigative journalists uncovering additional connections between the police department and city officials who had enabled or benefited from the corrupt system. The pressure on city officials intensified as constituents demanded accountability, with community forums drawing unprecedented attendance and activist organizations calling for a complete dissolution and rebuilding of the department under federal oversight. The rapidly expanding case caught the attention of national civil rights organizations, which deployed legal observers and support staff to assist victims in documenting their experiences and navigating the complex process of challenging wrongful convictions. "What we're seeing in West Point is not unique," explained civil rights attorney Benjamin Reynolds during a community meeting at First Baptist Church. "But the comprehensive evidence and federal attention make this a potential landmark case that could establish new precedents for police accountability nationwide." For Marcus Johnson, the investigation represented both professional vindication and personal reckoning, as he confronted the reality that the system he had served faithfully for 25 years had been actively working to undermine him and harm his community. "I always knew there was corruption," he confided to Director Chen during a rare moment of reflection between briefings. But seeing the deliberate targeting of black lives, including my own brother's, makes me question how much change is possible from within the system. The investigation's widening scope and increasing public attention set the stage for what would become a watershed moment in police accountability, with implications that would extend far beyond one department or one city challenging fundamental assumptions about law enforcement and racial justice in America. The corrupt system was not going down without a fight, and as the federal investigation gathered momentum, Captain Howard Miller mobilized his considerable political connections to launch a coordinated counteroffensive against the mounting melt, evidence, and public outrage. This is a witch hunt driven by anti-police sentiment, declared State Senator Richard Vaughn, a longtime recipient of police union donations, during a hastily arranged press conference on the steps of the state capitol. Deputy Director Johnson has a known bias against local law enforcement and is using this isolated incident to smear the reputation of dedicated officers, a statement so blatantly false in light of the evidence that it would have been laughable if not for the senator's influence over police oversight legislation. The local media landscape became a battleground as television station WKPT, owned by a real estate developer with ties to Chief Wallace, began running stories questioning Marcus's professional record and suggesting that he had orchestrated the entire incident to further his career ambitions. A smear campaign coordinated through the police union's extensive media contacts. The attacks quickly took a darker and more personal turn, as threats against Marcus and his family necessitated round-the-clock security at their home, with FBI agents discovering surveillance equipment installed on utility poles, with direct views into their windows, bearing fingerprints matching officers from Miller's inner circle. The harassment extended beyond physical intimidation, with Elaine Johnson discovering that her medical research grants were suddenly subject to random audits by university administrators with connections to the Police Foundation, while Georgetown Law School administrators contacted Tiana about concerns regarding her background check for bar admission, a transparent attempt to pressure Marcus through his daughter's career prospects. "They're trying to destroy everything we've built," Elaine observed grimly, as they reviewed the latest security report with their protective detail, her usual optimism replaced by justified paranoia after discovering their home had been vandalized with racist graffiti during a rare hour when it was left unguarded. This isn't just about corruption anymore, it's personal vengeance. The most calculated attack came when individuals matching the description of known police informants approached Calvin Johnson in prison, delivering explicit threats against his family, unless he signed a prepared statement claiming that Marcus had previously used his DEA position to plant evidence against his enemies, a fabrication designed to undermine the entire federal case by questioning Marcus's integrity. "They're getting desperate, U.S. Prime," Attorney Martinez noted when informed of the attempted manipulation. "This kind of witness tampering tells us we're getting close to something even bigger than what we've already uncovered." Inside the police department, evidence began disappearing at an alarming rate, with server crashes conveniently erasing years of digital records just hours before they were to be turned over to federal investigators, while case files, mentioned in Officer Donovan's testimony, were discovered shredded in industrial quantities, requiring forensic reconstruction by FBI document specialists. The conspiracy's tentacles reached even into the federal building, housing the investigation with a sophisticated break-in targeting specific evidence rooms, though the perpetrators were unaware that the most crucial materials had been secured in an off-site location, as a precaution against exactly such an attempt. Most concerning was the discovery of surveillance operations targeting task force members with unmarked vehicles, tracking federal agents between work and home, and electronic monitoring devices found attached to their personal vehicles, a Raider AZ. Dangerous escalation that prompted Director Chen to request additional security resources from Washington. "They're fighting for their lives," observed Special Agent Torres during a security briefing. "And they've got nothing left to lose, which makes them extremely dangerous." The investigation gained an unexpected ally when Detective Lisa Ramirez from West Point Police Department's Internal Affairs Division approached the task force through secure channels, offering her extensive documentation of thwarted investigations into the very officers now under federal scrutiny. "I've been trying to expose this for 3 years," she explained to Marcus during their initial meeting in a secure hotel room surrounded by armed federal agents. "Every time I got close to proving misconduct, my investigations were shut down by Chief Wallace. Personally, I've been documenting everything waiting for an opportunity like this." Ramirez's meticulously maintained records provided a roadmap of corruption that extended beyond Miller's operation to include judges who routinely approved questionable warrants, prosecutors who dropped cases against favored individuals, and city officials who directed police resources toward harassing political opponents or protecting friendly businesses. "This isn't just a corrupt captain and a few bad officers," Ramirez explained as she walked the task force through her evidence. "It's an entire ecosystem built around protecting power and profit at the expense of justice, especially for Black residents." Her insights proved invaluable in navigating department politics and identifying which officers might be persuaded to cooperate. Her years of careful observation, allowing the task force to target their efforts with surgical precision, focusing on officers with evidence of reluctant participation rather than enthusiastic corruption. "Officer Reynolds has a brother-in-law who was wrongfully convicted through this same system," she advised. "Approach him with evidence of how they manipulated cases similar to his relatives, and he'll likely turn." The psychological warfare intensified as the corrupt officers grew increasingly desperate, with rumors circulated through police channels that federal indictments were imminent, creating a pressure cooker atmosphere that pushed several officers to approach the task force, seeking immunity deals before their colleagues could beat them to it. "They're turning on each other now," Marcus observed, as he reviewed the growing list of cooperating witnesses. "The same blue wall of silence that protected them for years is crumbling under federal pressure." The most vicious counterattacks were reserved for Marcus himself, as the corrupt officers focused their efforts on discrediting the man whose arrest had triggered their downfall, fabricating stories about improper conduct during his DEA operations, and attempting to paint him as biased against local law enforcement, despite his 25-year record of interagency cooperation. Anonymous sources fed false information to sympathetic reporters, claiming that Marcus had a vendetta against the West Point Police Department stemming from his brother's legitimate arrest, a narrative designed to undermine both his credibility and the mountain of evidence supporting the federal case. "They're trying to make this about me rather than their crimes," Marcus noted during a strategy session with the prosecution team. "We need to keep the focus on the hundreds of victims whose lives were destroyed by this corruption, not get drawn into defending my reputation." The personal cost of standing against such powerful and desperate opponents weighed heavily on the Johnson family, with Elaine and Marcus having whispered conversations late into the night about whether the fight was worth the constant threat to their safety and careers, only to conclude each time that backing down would betray not only their principles, but the hundreds of victims still seeking justice for years of systematic abuse. "We didn't choose this fight," Elaine reminded her husband during a rare moment of doubt. "But now that we're in it, we have a responsibility to see it through, not just for us, but for everyone who didn't have our resources and position to fight back." As the corrupt system marshaled its considerable resources for a final stand against accountability, the battle lines were drawn for what would become not just a legal proceeding, but a referendum on justice itself, in a system long daters accustomed to operating with impunity. What would you do if you were Marcus Johnson, facing threats against your family while fighting to expose corruption? Comment number 1. If you would continue the fight no matter the personal cost, or comment number 2, if you think protecting your family should come first. Like and subscribe to follow this incredible story of courage in the face of systemic corruption. Do you think the corrupt officers will succeed in their attempts to discredit Marcus and the federal investigation, or will justice ultimately prevail against such powerful opposition? The formal legal proceedings against the corrupt officers began with an unprecedented display of federal force as U.S. Attorney Gloria Martinez assembled a specialized prosecution team of 12 attorneys with extensive experience in police corruption cases, sending a clear message about the government's commitment to securing convictions. This case represents one of the most significant police corruption prosecutions in recent history. Martinez announced at a press conference following the first grand jury session. The systematic violation of civil rights evidence, tampering, drug trafficking, and obstruction of justice we've uncovered demands the full attention and resources of the Justice Department. The grand jury proceedings expanded over 6 weeks as a parade of witnesses testified about various aspects of the corruption, from former arrestees describing how evidence was planted on them to fellow officers detailing the internal workings of Captain Miller's operation, creating a comprehensive picture of a department that had operated as a criminal enterprise for nearly a decade. The strategic decisions about which officers to offer cooperation agreements became increasingly complex as more participants in the corruption sought to save themselves by implicating others with prosecutors, carefully weighing the value of testimony against the severity of individual crimes. Officer Donovan's early cooperation gives him significant advantage, Martinez explained to Marcus during a strategy session. His testimony about Kemp's routine evidence planting corroborated by your recordings makes him valuable enough to justify limited immunity. But Captain Miller and Chief Wallace are too deeply implicated to receive any meaningful reduction, regardless of cooperation. The announcement of the first wave of indictments sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community, with 27 current and former West Point police officers charged with crimes ranging from civil rights violations to drug, trafficking, and conspiracy, while Chief Wallace was named as an unindicted co-conspirator, a designation that prevented him from continuing in office while avoiding the legal complications of charging the department's highest official before the case against his subordinates was fully established. The police union's response was swift and predictable, hiring a team of high-powered defense attorneys led by former federal prosecutor William Hargrove, whose specialty in defending law enforcement had earned him the nickname "Cop's Best Friend" in legal circles. These officers are being scapegoated for following departmental policies approved at the highest levels of city government, Hargrove declared at his first press appearance. The real question is why Deputy Director Johnson was operating undercover in another agency's jurisdiction without proper notification. A transparent attempt to shift focus from the overwhelming evidence of corruption to procedural technicalities. The defense strategy quickly centered on suppressing Marcus's recordings, filing motions arguing that his decision to record officers without identifying himself as a federal agent constituted entrapment and violated department policies requiring notification when federal agents operate in local jurisdictions. The foundation of the government's case rests on illegally obtained evidence, Hargrove argued in preliminary hearings. Deputy Director Johnson deliberately concealed his identity to provoke officers into actions they wouldn't otherwise have taken, creating, rather than documenting, wrongdoing. This legal maneuver was accompanied by a coordinated media campaign portraying the case as an attack on policing itself rather than a legitimate prosecution of criminal behavior, with law enforcement organizations across the country issuing statements of support for the indicted officers and condemning federal overreach into local policing matters. "This case isn't about corruption, it's about control," declared the president of the National Police Association during a televised interview. Federal agencies have been trying to dictate local policing for years, and this prosecution is just their latest attempt to undermine the autonomy of departments that prioritize public safety over political correctness. The assignment of Judge William Henderson to oversee the case provided a rare moment of optimism for the prosecution team, as his reputation for fairness and previous rulings on police misconduct suggested he would evaluate the evidence on police misconduct, the lockspactabewbox.com, its merits rather than yielding to political pressure. "Judge Henderson is exactly who we need for this case," James Wilson observed to Marcus after the assignment was announced. "He's respected by both sides, follows the law meticulously, and has shown in previous cases that he takes civil rights violations extremely seriously, regardless of who the perpetrators are. The judge's first significant ruling came during the critical suppression hearing, where defense attorneys had mounted their strongest challenge to the admissibility of Marcus's recordings. The court finds that Deputy Director Johnson's recordings do not constitute entrapment, as the defense suggests Judge Henderson stated in his ruling. The evidence clearly shows that Officer Kemp initiated the illegal conduct without any inducement from Director Johnson, whose decision to record the interaction was consistent with his training and authority as a federal agent investigating potential civil rights violations. This ruling delivered a devastating blow to the defense strategy, preserving the most compelling evidence of wrongdoing and establishing a precedent that would govern subsequent evidentiary challenges. The pretrial hearings featured dramatic testimony from both victims and cooperating officers, with Marcus's account of his arrest and the subsequent investigation drawing national media attention. "I did not set out that evening intending to expose police corruption," he testified with characteristic composure. "I simply made the decision that many Black Americans make every day when facing discrimination to document what happens to us rather than simply enduring it in silence. The only difference is that I had the resources and position to ensure that documentation led to accountability." Officer Donovan's public testimony proved equally compelling, as he detailed the systematic practice of planting evidence on Black suspects and the department's unofficial targeting policies. "We were instructed to maintain what Captain Miller called community standards in certain neighborhoods," Donovan explained under oath. "That meant stopping any Black person driving through Riverdale or other affluent areas, finding a reason to search their vehicle, and if nothing was found, making something up or planting evidence to justify an arrest. The goal was to create a gators, hostile environment that would discourage their presence in these neighborhoods." The testimony from victims of the department's corrupt practices provided the emotional weight that complemented the technical evidence, with dozens of individuals describing how false arrests had destroyed their lives, cost them jobs, and homes, separated them from their families, and left them with criminal records that continued to limit their opportunities long after serving unjust sentences. "I lost 3 years of my life for drugs that Officer Kemp pulled from his own pocket," testified Michael Robinson, a former high school teacher whose arrest had made national headlines 5 years earlier. "I lost my teaching career. My marriage fell apart while I was incarcerated, and I missed the birth of my daughter, all because I was a Black man driving through the wrong neighborhood on the wrong night." As the prosecution's case gained momentum, Officer Bradley Kemp's attorney approached U.S. Attorney Martinez, seeking a plea agreement, recognizing that the mounting evidence made conviction virtually certain. "My client is prepared to provide complete testimony about the department's operations in exchange for consideration at sentencing," the attorney proposed during a private meeting. He maintains that he was following established departmental practices and should not bear disproportionate responsibility for policies approved at much higher levels. Martinez's response was measured, but firm, making it clear that while Kemp's cooperation would be welcomed, his direct role in countless civil rights violations, including the arrest that sparked the investigation, meant that significant prison time was inevitable, regardless of his assistance to the prosecution. "Your client planted evidence on a federal agent while making explicitly racist comments that were captured on multiple recording devices," she reminded the attorney. "He has a documented history of similar conduct against dozens of other individuals over a period of years. Cooperation may reduce his sentence from 25 years to 15, but there will be no scenario where Officer Kemp avoids substantial time in federal prison." The legal proceedings created ripple effects throughout the criminal justice system, as defense attorneys across the region began challenging convictions in cases involving the indicted officers, creating a secondary wave of litigation that threatened to overwhelm the courts with hundreds of appeals and habeas corpus petitions. In response, Judge Henderson took the unprecedented step of establishing a special review panel of retired judges to evaluate these cases, systematically prioritizing those where individuals remained incarcerated based on potentially tainted evidence or testimony. The interests of justice demand that we address potential wrongful convictions with the same urgency as the prosecution of those responsible, the judge declared in establishing the panel. Every day that an innocent person remains incarcerated compounds the injustice that has already occurred. As the case proceeded toward trial, the legal battle increasingly became a referendum not just on specific corrupt officers, but on the system that had protected them for so long, raising fundamental questions about accountability, oversight, and the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they were sworn to protect and serve. The prosecution's methodical case-building suffered an unexpected acceleration when Officer Bradley Kemp, facing the prospect of becoming the primary scapegoat for the entire corrupt system, suffered what his attorney described as a crisis of conscience, but what prosecutors recognized more accurately as a survival calculation. My client has come to understand that he has been positioned to take the fall for policies and practices that originated far above his pay grade. Kemp's attorney informed U.S. Attorney Martinez during an urgent weekend meeting he's prepared to provide complete testimony about every aspect of the department's criminal activities, including direct orders from Chief Wallace and connections to city officials that haven't yet been identified by your office. Investigation. The negotiation that followed was tense and protracted, with prosecutors balancing the potential value of Kemp's testimony against the undeniable fact that he had been one of the most enthusiastic participants in the corruption, personally responsible for dozens of false arrests that had destroyed innocent lives. We can consider a reduction from 25 years to 12 years, with no possibility of parole before 10 years served. Martinez offered after consulting with her team and Director Chen. That's contingent on complete cooperation, comprehensive testimony against all co-conspirators, and a public acceptance of responsibility, including direct apologies to those whose lives were damaged by his actions. Kemp's comprehensive confession, provided over 4 days of videotaped interviews, exceeded even the prosecutor's expectations in its detail and scope, revealing aspects of the corruption that even the extensive federal investigation had not yet uncovered. The targeting of black citizens wasn't just informal policy, it was explicitly directed through monthly planning meetings. Kemp revealed providing dates and locations of these sessions where Captain Miller and Chief Wallace had personally established arrest quotas with racial breakdowns. They called it demographic balancing in their emails, but in the meetings, they were explicit that the goal was to reduce black presence in certain neighborhoods by creating a hostile environment through aggressive enforcement. Most damning were the records Kemp had secretly maintained as personal insurance, including audio recordings of Captain Miller instructing officers on evidence planting techniques and discussing how to coordinate testimony to ensure convictions, along with financial ledgers documenting the distribution of profits from seized drugs resold through the department's criminal network. Miller always told us to keep our mouths shut and we'd be protected, Kemp explained during his debriefing. But I've been in the department long enough to know that when things go bad, they find someone to sacrifice. So I started keeping records 3 years ago as insurance policy, never thinking I'd actually need to use them. Kemp's public plea hearing became a media sensation, with the former officer providing a detailed account of the department's corrupt practices and his own role in perpetuating them, culminating in a statement of remorse that, while clearly motivated by self-interest, nevertheless provided validation for the victims of his actions. I cannot undo the harm I've caused to countless innocent people through my actions, Kemp stated, reading from a prepared statement while avoiding eye contact with the gallery where many of his victims sat watching. I allowed racism and corruption to guide my actions as an officer, betraying both my oath and basic human decency. And while I know that no apology can restore the years lost or opportunities denied to those I wrongfully arrested, I accept full responsibility and will cooperate completely to ensure that those who directed these practices are held accountable. The fallout from Kemp's cooperation was immediate and dramatic, with Captain Howard Miller attempting to flee the country using a false passport only to be apprehended at Toronto Pearson International Airport by Canadian authorities. Working in coordination with the FBI, the captain's desperate escape attempt serving as further evidence of consciousness of guilt. Chief Wallace, meanwhile, collapsed during a deposition after being confronted with Kemp's evidence of his direct involvement in the corruption, suffering what was initially reported as a heart attack, but later clarified as a severe panic attack, resulting in his hospitalization under guard at West Point Medical Center. The disintegration of the department's command structure created a cascading effect as officers scrambled to secure their own cooperation agreements before their colleagues could implicate them, creating what one prosecutor described as a race to the bottom of loyalty as former brothers in blue turned on each other with remarkable speed. "We've never seen a blue wall crumble this quickly," observed FBI Special Agent Torres as he reviewed the growing list of cooperating witnesses. "The evidence is so overwhelming that they've abandoned any pretense of solidarity in favor of pure self-preservation." Mayor Sandra Parker, whose initial response to the scandal had been tepid calls for review, while defending the department's overall record, found herself facing a recall election as her own connections to the corrupt practices emerged. Through financial records showing campaign contributions laundered through police foundation events. The mayor was fully aware of the targeting policies a former aide testified before the grand jury. She referred to it as quality of life enforcement in public, but used very different language in private meetings with Chief Wallace, specifically directing increased arrests in neighborhoods where black residents were beginning to purchase homes. The federal takeover of the West Point Police Department was announced by the Justice Department following an emergency hearing before Judge Henderson, who granted the government's request for a receivership order, placing the department under direct federal control pending complete restructuring. The extent of corruption revealed in these proceedings has demonstrated that this department, as currently constituted, cannot be trusted to reform itself, Judge Henderson stated in his ruling. The pattern of civil rights violations, criminal activity, and obstruction of justice necessitates external intervention to ensure public safety and the protection of constitutional rights. Perhaps the most profound impact of the unraveling conspiracy was the establishment of a review task force dedicated to examining every case handled by the implicated officers, a massive undertaking that would eventually review over 1,500 convictions spanning more than a decade of corrupt practices. The first priority of this review was Calvin Johnson's case, which received expedited consideration given the clear evidence that his conviction had been part of a deliberate strategy to target Marcus's family. The court finds that the evidence against Calvin Johnson was fabricated in its entirety. Judge Henderson declared in an emotional hearing attended by both Johnson brothers. His conviction is hereby vacated, all records expunged, and the court offers its profound apology for the miscarriage of justice that deprived Mr. Johnson of 6 years of his life and damaged his relationship with his family. The moment of Calvin's release from prison provided one of the most powerful images of the entire case, as Marcus waited outside the gates to embrace the brother from whom he had been estranged for years, both men openly weeping as they reconciled in the presence of reporters and supporters who had gathered to witness this tangible symbol of justice, delayed but finally delivered. "I never stopped believing in you," Marcus told Calvin, words that carried the weight of years of unspoken pain and regret, "and I never stopped fighting to find the truth." Calvin's response captured the complex emotions of the moment. "I was so angry at you for so long," he admitted, still holding his brother's shoulders. "I thought you chose your badge over me, but you were using that badge to fight for justice all along, just in ways I couldn't see." The review process expanded rapidly, as more cases were examined, with dozens of wrongfully convicted individuals being released each week, as the extent of the fabricated evidence and perjured testimony became clear, creating both a great logistical challenge for processing so many overturned convictions and a moral obligation to provide support for people whose lives had been derailed by corrupt policing. "We're not just releasing people and wishing them good luck," explained Benjamin Reynolds, whose civil rights organization had established a re-entry support program specifically for victims of the West Point corruption. "We're providing housing assistance, employment connections, counseling services, and legal help, with restoring rights and clearing records, trying to give them back some small portion of what was stolen from them. Marcus found himself at the center of this healing process, meeting regularly with exonerated individuals and their families, using his position and influence to ensure that their stories were heard and their needs addressed in the wake of their belated vindication. What happened to you wasn't justice, it was weaponized racism, hiding behind badges, he told a group of recently released men during a support session at First Baptist Church. The system failed you, but that doesn't mean you have to face the future alone. We're committed to supporting your return to the lives that were interrupted and helping rebuild what was taken from you. The establishment of a victim compensation fund, initially funded by seized assets from the corrupt officers, but later supplemented by city and state appropriations, after successful civil litigation, provided tangible acknowledgement of the inappeased harm done, though no amount of money could truly compensate for years lost to wrongful imprisonment. We recognize that financial compensation cannot restore lost time with family missed opportunities or damaged reputations, Judge Henderson stated when approving the fund's structure. But it represents our system's acknowledgement of wrong done and commitment to tangible restitution beyond mere apologies. As the extent of the corruption and its human cost became fully apparent, the case triggered national policy discussions about police accountability, civilian oversight, and the need for systemic reforms to prevent similar abuses in other jurisdictions, transforming a local scandal into a catalyst for broader change in how America approached the intersection of law enforcement, race, and justice. 1 year after Marcus Johnson's wrongful arrest, the West Point Police Department bore little resemblance to the corrupt institution that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade, its transformation serving as a model for police reform initiatives across the country. The complete restructuring began with the appointment of Commissioner Lisa Ramirez, the former internal affairs detective whose thwarted investigations had documented the corruption long before federal intervention, her selection sending a clear message about the priority placed on integrity and accountability in the department's new era. We are building a department founded on constitutional policing, community trust, and transparency, Commissioner Ramirez declared at her swearing-in ceremony. The badge will be a symbol of public service rather than power, and every officer will understand that their primary obligation is to justice, not statistics or territory. The new oversight mechanisms implemented under the federal consent decree created multiple layers of accountability, including a civilian review board with actual disciplinary authority, mandatory body cameras with automatic activation and civilian access to footage, and an independent inspector general's office with the power to investigate officer misconduct without departmental interference. The reforms in West Point represent the most comprehensive police accountability structure in the nation, noted Justice Department spokesperson Michael Chen during the 6-month progress review. The technological safeguards, civilian oversight, and transparency requirements establish a new standard for departments nationwide. The most visible change came in the department's personnel, with over 60% of officers being replaced through a combination of criminal charges, resignations, and terminations for policy violations uncovered during the investigation, creating space for a new generation of officers recruited with an emphasis on community connection, de-escalation skills, and racial diversity that reflected the city's actual demographics. "We're not just changing policies, we're changing culture," explained Deputy Commissioner Robert Washington, who headed the recruitment initiative. "Every aspect of our hiring, training, and promotion is designed to build a department that serves the entire community with equal respect and protection." The community policing initiatives that replaced the aggressive enforcement of previous years centered on relationship building and collaborative problem solving, with officers assigned to specific neighborhoods for extended periods to develop meaningful connections with residents, community advisory councils, providing input on local priorities, and regular public forums where citizens could raise concerns directly with command staff without fear of retaliation. "I've lived in West Point for 40 years, and never thought I'd see the day when police officers would sit down in my living room and ask how they could better serve our neighborhood, remarked community elder Dorothy Williams during a town hall meeting in the predominantly black East Side district. "It doesn't erase the past, but it gives me hope for my grandchildren's future in this city." For Marcus Johnson, the aftermath of the case presented both professional opportunities and personal challenges as he navigated his unexpected role as a national symbol of resistance against corrupt policing while processing his own complex feelings about law enforcement after witnessing its darkest manifestations. "The DEA has offered me a promotion to assistant administrator. Overseeing national integrity initiatives," he confided to Elaine during a rare, quiet evening at home. The security detail that had become a fixture of their lives finally reduced as the most serious threats subsided. It would mean moving to Washington, overseeing reform efforts across federal agencies, essentially building on what happened here to create systemic change nationwide. Elaine's response reflected her characteristic blend of supportive partnership and independent perspective. "You've earned that recognition many times over," she acknowledged, taking his hand across the dinner table. "But the question isn't whether you deserve the promotion, it's whether that's the work you feel called to do now, after everything that's happened." Marcus's ultimate decision surprised many colleagues, but felt inevitable to those who knew him best, as he declined the prestigious promotion in favor of establishing the Johnson Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting wrongfully convicted individuals and advocating for police accountability legislation across the country. "I've spent 25 years working within the system," he explained at the organization's launch event. "Now I need to work alongside communities that have been harmed by that system's failures, using the platform and privilege I've been given to amplify voices that have been systematically silenced." The reconciliation with his brother Calvin became one of the most meaningful aspects of Marcus's journey, healing a family wound that had festered for years and creating a powerful partnership as Calvin joined the initiative as Director of Community Outreach, using his first-hand experience of wrongful conviction to connect with others, rebuilding their lives after similar injustices. "My brother and I took different paths through America's broken justice system," Calvin told a congressional committee during hearings on police reform legislation. "He wore a badge while I wore prison clothes, but we both witnessed the same corruption from different angles, and now we're united in fighting for a system that actually delivers the justice it promises." The criminal proceedings against the corrupt officers concluded with a series of high-profile convictions and substantial sentences, with Captain Howard Miller receiving 30 years in federal prison for charges including drug trafficking, racketeering, civil rights violations, and conspiracy to obstruct justice, while Chief Wallace's health complications resulted in a plea agreement for 15 years under house arrest and full cooperation with ongoing investigations into city officials' involvement. Today's sentences send an unambiguous message that those who abuse the power of the badge will face consequences proportionate to the trust they betrayed U.S. Attorney Martinez stated after the final sentencing hearing. "No position of authority places anyone above the law or beyond accountability for violations of constitutional rights." Officer Sean Donovan's early cooperation and evident remorse earned him the most lenient sentence among the indicted officers, with his 5-year term, including the condition that upon release he would work with police training academies to educate future officers about the subtle ways corruption takes root and the importance of moral courage in reporting misconduct. "I didn't start my career intending to become part of a criminal conspiracy," Donovan told a class of police cadets during his first presentation after serving his sentence. "I made a series of small compromises that seemed justified at the time, each one making the next compromise easier, until I found myself participating in and witnessing crimes that violated everything I had sworn to uphold." The broader impact of the West Point case extended far beyond the city limits, influencing police practices and accountability measures nationwide as departments sought to implement proactive reforms rather than risk similar federal intervention. The West Point model of civilian oversight became a template for legislation in multiple states, while the case studies developed from the investigation were incorporated into FBI training for public corruption investigations and justice Department procedures for pattern or practice inquiries into troubled departments. What happened in West Point has become a watershed moment in policing, observed former Attorney General Robert Mitchell during a law enforcement leadership conference. Not because the corruption was unique, but because the response was so comprehensive and the reforms so fundamental that they've changed our national conversation about what effective constitutional policing looks like in practice. For the Johnson family, the personal cost of standing against corruption was balanced by the profound impact of their courage, with Tiana completing law school and joining the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, inspired by her parents' example of principled resistance to injustice, despite the personal risks involved. My parents taught me that having privilege and position means nothing if you don't use it to help those who don't have the same advantages, she explained during her swearing-in ceremony. Watching them stand firm when it would have been easier to compromise showed me what justice work really means. The most meaningful validation came not from institutional recognition or policy changes, but from the individual lives transformed by the case, with Marcus maintaining relationships with many of the exonerated individuals whose freedom had resulted from the investigation, witnessing their gradual rebuilding of lives interrupted by corrupt policing and finding in their resilience the ultimate affirmation of the fight's worth. When I see Calvin reconnecting with his children, or Michael Robinson teaching again, or Sarah Jenkins starting her own business after 8 years of wrongful imprisonment, I know that all the threats and attacks we endured were a small price. For the justice that was finally delivered, Marcus reflected during the initiative's first anniversary gathering. Systems don't change without people willing to stand against them when they're wrong, regardless of the personal cost. The transformed West Point Police Department marked its 1-year anniversary under new leadership with community celebration events throughout the city, featuring officer community basketball games, neighborhood cookouts, and open houses at renovated precinct buildings, now designed with community meeting spaces and transparent architectural features, symbolizing the department's new commitment to openness and accessibility. We still have tremendous work ahead to earn back trust that was systematically destroyed over decades. Commissioner Ramirez acknowledged during the main celebration in Civic Center Park. But for the first time, we're measuring success by community well-being rather than arrest numbers, building relationships instead of fear, and holding ourselves accountable to the people we serve rather than to a corrupt system. The former corrupt officers' fates provided a stark contrast to the community's renewal, with most serving substantial federal sentences in facilities far from the city where they had abused their authority, their fall from power. Complete. As they experienced the same justice system, they had manipulated this time from the perspective of the convicted rather than the accusers. Officer Donovan's journey toward redemption through education represented the possibility of learning from even the darkest chapters, his frank discussions with new officers about the warning signs of corruption and the importance of moral courage, providing a preventative counterpoint to the punitive consequences faced by his former colleagues. The lasting impact on racial justice in law enforcement extended beyond specific policies or personnel changes to a fundamental reconsideration of the relationship between police and black communities with the documented evidence of documented evidence. Systematic targeting, creating undeniable proof of what black Americans had described for generations, but had often been dismissed as perception rather than reality. The West Point case matters because it removed plausible deniability, explained civil rights leader Dr. James Wilson at a national policy forum. The meticulous documentation of racist practices captured on official recordings and confirmed by the officers' own records means we can move past debating whether systemic racism exists in policing to addressing how to dismantle it effectively. The final scene of Marcus mentoring young black federal agents about integrity and courage brought his journey full circle as he shared both the professional insights and personal costs of standing against corruption within a system designed to protect its own. "Your badge doesn't define your integrity, it tests it daily," he told the assembled agents during a special training session at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. There will be moments when you must choose between career advancement and moral clarity, between fitting in and standing up. And those choices will define not just your career, but the justice system itself for everyone who encounters it. As Marcus concluded his presentation, a young agent raised her hand with the question that had followed him since the case began. Given everything you experienced, would you make the same choice again, knowing the personal cost to you and your family? The room fell silent as Marcus considered his response, his expression reflecting both the weight of the journey and the certainty of his conviction. Without hesitation, he answered finally, "Because corruption thrives when good people calculate that the personal risk of confronting it outweighs the collective harm of tolerating it, and that's a calculation I refuse to accept regardless of the cost." The impact of one man's courage in the face of systematic injustice had transformed not just a police department, but the national conversation about accountability, demonstrating that even the most entrenched corruption could be dismantled when confronted with unwavering integrity and the determination to ensure that justice applied equally to those who enforce the law and those subject to it. What would you do if you witnessed injustice being committed by those sworn to uphold the law? Would you have the courage to stand up like Marcus Johnson, even at great personal risk? Comment below with your thoughts on this powerful story. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you believe in the importance of accountability and justice for all. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most significant cases of police accountability in recent history, and remember that change begins when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary injustice. The story of Marcus Johnson teaches us that systemic change often begins with one person's courage to stand against injustice. When confronted with discrimination, Marcus chose documentation over silent acceptance, using his training and position to expose corruption that had destroyed countless lives. His strategic patience enduring temporary humiliation to build an airtight case demonstrates that sometimes justice requires playing the long game rather than seeking immediate vindication. The corruption in West Point reminds us how power without accountability inevitably corrupts, especially when racial bias provides convenient targets. What began as individual prejudice evolved into an organized criminal enterprise protected by institutional silence and political connections. We also learn the importance of comprehensive reform rather than superficial changes. The transformation of West Point's police department succeeded because it addressed culture, personnel, oversight, and community relationships simultaneously, not just changing policies on paper. Perhaps most importantly, the story illustrates how racial justice requires evidence-based action. The meticulous documentation of discrimination provided undeniable proof of what Black Americans had reported for generations, moving the conversation from debating whether systemic racism exists to implementing solutions. Finally, reconciliation between Marcus and Calvin shows that healing is possible even after profound injustice, but only when truth is fully acknowledged and systems are fundamentally changed to prevent future harm. What would you do if faced with the choice between personal safety and standing up against systemic injustice? Would you have the courage to document discrimination when experiencing it, or would you simply try to move past it? Comment below with how you think you would react in Marcus Johnson's position. If you believe that accountability in law enforcement is essential for a just society, hit that like button to support stories that highlight the importance of ethical policing. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories about individuals who have changed broken systems through their courage and determination. Have you or someone you know ever experienced racial profiling or discrimination from authorities? Share this video to spark important conversations about how we can build more equitable institutions that truly serve and protect all communities equally. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most significant cases of police accountability in recent history. Remember that change begins when ordinary people refuse to accept extraordinary injustice, and everyone has a role to play in building a more just world.